Okay. First of all, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you also for the people who are online or join us online today. Today's conference will focus on mnemonic constitutionalism. We decided to use the title memory as a shield and sword of constitutions because of the fact that we want to deepen the use and abuse of memory within constitutions. And today's debate will focus on that, trying to express it within different lenses. Actually, at the very beginning, today's conference was organized trying to put together people coming from the law department with the law perspective from the Dirpolis Institute at Sant'Anna and also from political science, because today we were supposed to have with us Professor Barbara Henry, but she can't be here today. So we will have our first panel with Professor Giacomo Delledonne and Dr. Uladzislau from the University of Amsterdam. Professor Giacomo Delledonne will start trying to frame the debate of today's session, trying to give us an introduction of what is memory and why memory is relevant for constitutions. And then we will have Belavusau that will give us all the instruments to better understand how mnemonic constitutionalism is relevant when we speak about constitution, why is relevant, and in which context we can actually understand the concept of mnemonic constitutionalism. So I leave the floor to Professor Delledonne. He is gonna introduce the panel, and thank you so much again for coming.
So can you hear me? Okay. So good morning, everyone. My name is Giacomo Delledonne. I'm an associate professor of constitutional law here at the Scuola Sant'Anna, and I'm one of the editors of the STALS project and paper archive. STALS stands for Sant'Anna Legal Studies, alongside Professor Martinico, sitting here, and Professor Filippo Fontanelli from the University of Edinburgh. I would like, first of all, to provide some elements about the genesis of this meeting this afternoon. We are very pleased, very lucky to host our speakers, Belavusau, Carna Pistan, and thank you, Roberto Taysier, for being here. So this event follows in the footsteps of a research project that was conducted at Scuola Sant'Anna alongside 3 other institutions in Italy, a research project funded by the Italian Ministry of Universities and Research within the as part of the National Recovery Plan. And the title of this project, which started in 2023, was Identitarian Public Law Dynamics of Liberal Exclusion and Democratic Inclusion. The project looked into the salience, the presence of identitarian arguments in public law, so constitutional law and religion, with a strong comparative focus. And in order to, so what do identitarian arguments stand for? We focus pretty much on religiously inspired arguments and arguments based on history, on a reconstructed, a mythified history. So this event was conceived as a not a follow-up, so a second time after the end of our research project. And in order to move a step further, we decided to involve other people than those we have had the chance to hear, to listen to during the previous years. A few words. So, Uladzislau has been one of the co-editors of a few volumes, including one very recent on the politics of memory laws, Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. And I'm quoting, that's great. I'm quoting a few excerpts from the introductory chapter. The co-editors of this book point to a quite well-known phenomenon, that is the rise of memory laws in the West. So laws that officially embrace a specific account of history and may provide for sanctions, including criminal sanctions for violations, for those who don't subscribe to this official reading of history. But so they started from this and they point to something more. So it isn't just about memory laws. There is a presence of memory and history in constitutional law. Constitutional law understood in a quite broad sense, so not just the constitution proper. A few examples are possible, the most prominent among them being perhaps Hungary, at least if we limit the scope of our analysis within to the European Union. So mnemonic constitutionalism, that is a type of constitutionalism that encompasses yet transcends pure measures against genocide, denialism, and declarative memory laws, postulating or commemorating certain historical events. So the point is we are looking beyond memory laws. We are focusing on constitutional law, the law of the Constitution in a quite broad sense. So what I would like to talk about in this introductory intervention is something very general about the interplay of constitution, history, and memory. This is an issue in which, let's say, we notice that much of what we may imply about the place of history and memory in constitutional law is the product of what we think of the Constitution, of what the Constitution is about. If we subscribe to a classically liberal view of the Constitution, we may think of constitutional documents as a mere instrument of government, but this is a relatively, let's say, old-fashioned view of the Constitution. If we consider post-World War II Constitution, to put it quite simply, what we notice is, first and foremost, that constitutions are not neutral. Their non-neutrality means that they embrace a set of values. Constitutions incorporate axiological demands and translate them into positive law. Such non-neutral attitude also affects the issue of history and memory. I will make just a few examples, mostly from the West, so in order not to trespass. Constitutions, for instance, those we are familiar with in the Constitution of the Italian Republic, the Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany, but also, to quote a less fortunate example, the French Constitution of 1946, which established the Fourth Republic, were drafted out of an effort to make sense of the reasons of the downfall of the liberal democratic regimes in the interwar years, and to prevent a similar slippery slope in the foreseeable future. These long constitutions from the post-World War II years are very rich in substantive contents, the entrenched values, etc. But they are also, they turn an eye on the past. There is a famous metaphor that has been coined by Tsvetan Todorov and further built upon by philosophers like Salvatore Vecca, the memory of the evil. So constitutions, post-war constitutions are marked and defined by the memory of the evil, which allows also to make sense of certain provisions. For instance, Article 1 of the German Basic Law, human dignity is inviolable. It's a provision which, of course, has something to say about the present and the future, but it's defined by a certain reading of the past. So the memory of the evil is a crucial segment of post-war constitution. And if I have to quote an excerpt, I will refer to the preamble to the French Constitution of 1946. In the aftermath of the victory of free people over regimes that attempted to enslave and humiliate the human person, the French people proclaim once again that every human being, without distinction of race, religion, or belief, possesses inalienable and sacred rights. So constitutions are not foreign to history and memory-related concerns. Now the following question is, what about history? What about memory? So here we are, in a way, at the crossroads between different disciplines, and as a constitutional lawyer, I'm mostly interested in history that is entrenched into constitutional provisions, and when it is entrenched, it may also be reconstructed, rewritten, redefined, and possibly turned into a myth. So much so about history. Then there is let's say, a further step, memory. Memory as something distinct, at least at first glance, from history. Here there are a number of relevant authors, for instance, Maurice Alvax or Pierre Nora, a historian who edited a monumental collective work on les lieux de mémoire. And so the idea is, on the one hand, you have history as the study of a distant past and memory as a collective shared experience. In fact, the line of separation between these categories may not be that self-evident as these definitions suggest. So, as a judge from the Italian Constitutional Court, Professor Massimo Luciani, has suggested, memory is the raw material out of which we make history. So there is no sharp distinction between these two perspectives. And in fact, also a prominent historian like Marc Bloch wrote that historians focus on the present to understand the past. Be that as it may, we are focusing not on individual memory, but on memory as a shared experience. And that's why memory, like history, is relevant for constitutional law. So since law can be defined in multiple ways. So if we focus on the law as a social enterprise, memory is relevant to constitutional law insofar as it is conceived as a shared experience of the past. In this respect, there's a quite convincing point made by Jack Wolkin, according to which collective memory is a set of narratives, icons, symbols, and events that contribute to defining the identity of the members of a social group, a pre-understanding of the past that helps shape the group in the present and beyond. Of course, so memory is relevant to constitutions. Now, the following step is, how can constitution address memory-related issues? And here, of course, let's say things may be a little more difficult. Sometimes the past is something that shouldn't come back. So think, for instance, of limits on constitutional amendments, on eternity clauses. They may be read in multiple ways, in minimalistic ways or more generous ways. If you think, for instance, of the case law, the German Federal Constitutional Court on how to interpret the eternity clause, the German Federal Constitutional Court, as early as the 1970s, opted for a quite minimalistic reading, according to which the eternity clause in Article 79 of the Basic Law should be read as a prohibition to restore the National Socialist regime. Memory also coexists with oblivion. And here a significant example is in our Constitution, the Constitution of the Italian Republic, the 13th final and transitional provision with the, we discussed this in class. So with the following debate between leading figures of Italian constitutional scholarship like Carlo Esposito and Costantino Mortati on whether this provision should be interpreted as a provisional ban to rebuild, reestablish the National Fascist Party as it had existed between 1919 and World War II, or an all-encompassing provision to rebuild something which more or less echoes the ideas, behavior, and objectives of the Italian National Fascist Party. So the past is a quite difficult material to be dealt with. A further remark. So until now, I have focused on the Constitution as a codified document. So something that is drafted at some point according to a procedure, or it may have been amended later, but so a codified, clearly identifiable document. When it comes to constitution and memory, a convenient approach suggests to conceive the Constitution not as something given at some point, but as a process. So something that evolves over time, thanks to legislation, to case law, also to an evolution in what Albert V. Dicey called the legislative public opinion, so the dominant feelings, the dominant ideas in a social groups, what Peter Heberle might have called the open society of the interpreters of the Constitution, which contribute to shaping and to reshaping the Constitution over time. And this is quite important, since this also applies to memory. So memory and the Constitution may evolve over time. I will mention a couple of examples from the other side of the Alps. One of them is quite illuminating. So in France, after the Declaration of Paris in August 1944, an ordinance said that the Republican legality was being restored in French territory. And meanwhile, it stated that legally, in legal terms, the Republic as a form of state hadn't ceased to exist because of the Vichy regime. And it also added, Vichy is null and void. All constitutional, legislative, or regulatory acts promulgated on continental territory after June 1940 were declared null and void because of the non-existence in law of the Vichy regime. And this was the official, let's say, French doctrine until the 1990s, so 50 years later. There's a turning point, a speech given by a Gaullist president of the Republic, Jacques Chirac, in Paris in 1995, in a place called Delledonne d'Hiver, where German SS had organized a roundup of Jewish and other persecuted people. And President Chirac stated the criminal acts of the German occupying forces had been supported by the French, supported by the French state. France committed the irreparable on that day, breaking its word. So it corrected, it amended, let's say, the official entrenched version of the continuity or the non-continuity of the state during World War II, with specific regard to the pro-German regime in Vichy, led by Marshal Pétain. And of course, lay people, historians may already have been familiar with this alternative reading of the events, but the fact that the head of state, on the occasion of a solemn ceremony, had embraced such view of the events during the German occupation, of course, represented a turning point and meant that there had been an evolution, let's say, in the Constitution, understood not as a codified document, of course, in this case, but as a process to whose implementation different actors concur. Another similar example applies to the Federal Republic of Germany, 41 years ago, when Bonn was still its capital city. In fact, it was the 8th of May, so it's the exact anniversary. So the day when the Third Reich, the Nazi Reich, announced its complete surrender to the Anglo-American and Soviet allies. So it was a day of defeat. And the federal president of Germany on that day, in 1985, said, well, this was in fact a day of liberation. Ein Tag der Befreiung. This speech was widely celebrated. Now it has also been a bit deconstructed. But the important point is that the president, Richard von Weizsäcker, built on historiographical research that had already come to similar conclusions, but this was not common sense with the general people. So the fact that the federal president embraced this view of the German history since 1945 was, of course, a defining moment. Of course, this idea of the Constitution as a process is not exempt from tensions and also quite serious conflicts, because, for instance, metabolizing, reworking the issue of colonialism within European Constitution may be more difficult, more exposed to partisan contestations. And of course, shifts in memory may also have clearly destabilizing consequences. And here, a prominent example in the West is Spain, where some aspects of the memory policies that have been promoted in, let's say, the last 7 to 8 years or so may, not necessarily, but may undermine some components of the value system embraced during the constitution making process in 1978. This is, of course, is unfinished business, and there is an ongoing academic debate, but of course, so constitutions evolve, but sometimes this evolution may come with a cost and threaten to destabilize the very foundations of the constitutional order. I think I have more or less exhausted my time. I have mostly made reference to Western European examples. I think that today we will have other Western perspectives, Western insights, and also something from Central and Eastern Europe, where, of course, this issue of mnemonic constitutionalism is very prominent, because it also comes with, let's say, it's one of the facets, one of the components of constitutional decay and democratic retrogression in Central and Eastern Europe. So it's something that extends beyond the mere issue of the policy of memory. As Rebecca has already said, unluckily we will not have Professor Barbara Henry with us, so, but we are very happy to have both of you, Roberto, as our guests this afternoon, and so thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Professor. Sorry, just I don't want to. Thank you so much, Professor, for your introduction. Thank you also not only for framing the debate, the general debate, but also for showing us the Western perspective introduction, like to making an introduction with also the Western perspective, because in this way we can have an even more comparative discussion precisely because of the fact that today we will see addressed the Central and Eastern Europe perspective. And now I'm really happy to introduce Ulad Belavusau. He comes from the University of Amsterdam. He has focused a lot his work and his studies on memory and the role that it has in laws and constitution. And he is also part of a really important project that is called Memocracy. But I think that maybe he can tell us more about it, and I'm leaving the floor to him. Today's presentation is called Mnemonic Constitutionalism, History, Citizenship, Ritual, and some Constitution. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I guess my voice spreads equally, right? You hear me? Does that work? For also for the online audience. So it is my pleasure, as conventional as it is, to start the presentation, but also a huge surprise. This invitation came completely out of blue. I, for a long time, have an eye on wonderful scholarship that is done here, in particular in constitutional law, and the work of both of Giacomo and Giuseppe in particular. And yeah, I was absolutely delighted when several months ago I was contacted and approached with the view of organizing this workshop. So I'm glad to meet new people, make new friends, including also Rebecca, of course, and also to catch up with the old connaissance, so to say, the people I either cooperated or met on different encounters. So both Carna and Roberto, of course. So huge pleasure to be in beautiful Pisa. Exactly 15 years ago, after my graduation from the nearby, I did my PhD in Florence. So Pisa used to be, the destination of once a couple of weeks going and meeting some friends here. So. Well, talking about mnemonic constitutionalism today, I unfold this story. Oh, I did as always something wrong. I unfold this story through. Does that? I think we need to use this one to close. I think I had experience with this before.
Yeah, you can just.
This exactly, yeah. So today I will unfold this story starting by the terminology. So if we're talking about the elephant in the room, already, of course, Giacomo did a great job in kind of placing the contours of this concept. And since Rebecca also mentioned the project of Memocracy, where we try to operationalize both from the political science perspective, the concept of Memocracy itself and mnemonic constitutionalism as applied to comparative constitutional law, I will tell a couple of words how exactly it's different from memory laws. And I'm afraid that it's absolutely impossible to separate those two subjects, la loi mémorielle, the memory loss, and mnemonic constitutionalism, without giving a couple of examples of how exactly memory laws operate both in Western and Eastern Europe, and how we are seeing the phenomenon, which is certainly getting beyond this very specific legal regulation. And in doing so, I will unfold a couple of countries in more detail, if the time permits, in particular France, Germany, Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal. I will talk a little bit about a very interesting case of constitutionalism without a formal constitution of Israel. And then I will get into the examples from Central and Eastern Europe, where, as was noted by Giacomo, indeed, the matter is getting a completely different elevated subject of securitization, and mnemonic constitutionalism is even argued to be the factor of governance itself. And if the time permits, I will bring a very exotic topic, something which remains unpublished and on which I'm working now. My interest is more and more moving beyond Europe in trying to see how the patterns of transplanting the conceptual framework of memory loss and mnemonic constitutionalism moves into transitional justice in Latin America, and even more fascinating region for me recently is East Asia, and I just finished a paper on China. So I would like to share some modest findings on how I see, the convergence of ideas and global rise of mnemonic constitutionalism and memory loss elsewhere. So when we are referring to mnemonic constitutionalism, I think we can talk about three distinctive formulas. So the first typology of memory loss we can deconstruct is conceptual. As is that. So mnemonic constitutionalism is about conceptual limitation of powers, because any constitutionalism is essentially about limiting powers in one way or another. But when we are talking about constitutionalism, we're thinking about very formal structures, rights and duties, institutions, institutes of limitations, right expiration clauses, non-expiration clauses. Whereas here, we're talking something very emotional. We're getting in the terrain of historical memory, which in itself is extremely emotionalized terrain. We're getting into trauma, we're getting into ritual, we're getting into identity. And in this way, the function of mnemonic constitutionalism is to connect constitutional law, collective memory, democratic belonging, and produce a certain institutional innovation, because as has been shown in the recent scholarship of the 10 years, it is precisely this factor that brings the institutional rise of memory institutes, quite formally, memory entities. In Central and Eastern Europe, very often addresses institutes of national remembrance, and elsewhere, being the subject of institutions of transitional justice, the patterns which we see in Latin America and in Africa and in some European countries. Then, at this point, we can perhaps start theorizing mnemonic constitutionalism a little bit away, transcending the confines of conceptual framework and postulating it as a research method in itself. So how about combining constitutional analysis with memory studies, citizenship? Because as I will try to unfold in my reconstruction of constitutional identity, it is, and historical memory, the factor in the constitution that is most often affected by historical memory is actually citizenship, in both functional way, in the way we get citizenship, get naturalized, denaturalized, but also in a more symbolic sense, this kind of republican citizenship in terms of what our civil duties and how citizenship is postulated as a virtue. And of course, the discourse analysis, something that we learn from political scientists, international relations, and historians. And in this way, the function of mnemonic constitutionalism is to reveal constitutional dynamics that sometimes might be overlooked by those rigid classical legal methods, which are focused narrowly on institutions, rights, or formal doctrine. And thirdly, we can look into mnemonic constitutionalism as a certain governance paradigm in itself. And in this way, it is very close to what is coined by a colleague of mine in international relations, Maria Malks in Copenhagen University, as mnemocracy. So the idea that historical memory in itself can be a regime, political regime, that shapes constitutional parameters of our citizenship, security, geopolitics, and performs as de facto in international relations, because either we use it as a form of deterrence, or we use historical memories as postulated in the title of this wonderful conference, either as a shield or as a sword to attack our neighbors or find alliances. And in this way, this governance paradigm is moving us from constitutional law, or rather interaction of constitutional law with the theory of international relations, with this classical constructivism, but in this way, it's kind of finding alliances and international dialogue through historical memory, and very often through this constitutional dialogue, sometimes very directly, with tuning constitutional clauses in between countries, sometimes indirectly through the institutes of national remembrances and the whole infrastructure and a whole institutional innovation that is brought by mnemonic constitutionalism. But the mnemonic constitutionalism is something that, as the terminology appeared rather recently, its pedigree is about 7-8 years, although growing in the literature. What we've been addressing in the literature since 2000, this is obviously not a new phenomenon that has been coined by the French historians, is les lois mémorielles, something which was already addressed by Giacomo. Well, les lois mémorielles themselves appeared in France, and that's why in English they sound so awkward, and in many countries, in many languages, it's very hard to translate them without losing the substance and converting adjective into the noun. But the idea was that somewhere at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, so actually quite late, 40 years after the finish of the Second World War, there was this question of what are we doing with Holocaust deniers? And Germany was the first country that prohibited the Shoah by extending essentially Volksverhetzung, the Citement Clause 130 article in German criminal code, saying that Auschwitz lie is also part of this hate speech, and gradually throughout the 90s, 2000s, extending this clause even more, and giving the rise to what is usually addressed in literature even wider than Holocaust denialism as the genocide denialism. Surprisingly, even Israel, itself, by the law of the Knesset, adopts the prohibition of Holocaust denialism very, very late in 1989. So not in the 50s, 60s, as you would imagine, when most of the Holocaust, the survivors of the Holocaust are alive and around. So kind of 80s, 90s is already when we see the decline in numbers. But it inevitably raises the uncomfortable elephant in the room. While there was definitely consensus on the Holocaust back then, and apart from several people in France, Germany, and a huge machinery of Holocaust denialism somewhere between Florida and California in the United States, I mean, it was more or less an established fact transcribed in the textbooks, about 6 million of Holocaust victims, and most historians had absolutely consensus on this. The question was, what are we doing with other mass atrocities, including the atrocities of the 20th century? Let's say, how about Armenian genocide in Turkey? So what makes Holocaust so special? Is it really the number? Is it this proximity to the day? Right? But then later in the 2000s, the question would emerge, how about Rwanda, for example? Right? Can we do these fresh instances of genocide being criminalized in terms of their denial? And that leads to this sort of competition. And in France started this competition because at first it simulacred this German way of Holocaust denialism, but not putting it in criminal law, but in media law. Most of the countries in the continental Europe since then did one way or another, either criminal law or media law in some way or another prohibits the denial of Holocaust. But in France, the question was also like, can we do the same for, let's say, the denial of the colonial atrocities of the French Empire somewhere in the Caribbeans? And well, while the parliament adopts a very similar law without a criminal clause, because the criminal clause was present only for the Holocaust, which, by the way, always raised this question about whataboutism, right? So what makes this Holocaust the Shoah so special? And yeah, but then there is this very similar legislation, which was adopted with the promotion of the then very popular socialist MP Taubira. That's why literature very often is addressed as Taubira law with regard to the colonial, the recognition of the colonial atrocities of the French Empire. But recognition is not necessarily prohibition in terms of punitive measure. And yet immediately after the adoption of the law, there were several associations in France that tried to argue in courts and mobilize the plaintiffs in arguing that the application of these laws for colonial heritage should be very similar to the Holocaust denialism. And while the court kind of said, cuckoo, no, we stop there, and in the Holocaust there is a punitive scope. Here there is no punitive scope either. Several historians back then were a subject of what these days would be probably framed as cancel culture. And back then, it was not about right or left. We were living in the world, perhaps, which was less antagonized in terms of Gaza-Israel conflict these days and everything. It was simply about the comparability. It was not really about right or left, because the adoption of these laws led to the mobilization of historians from both right, left, and the center in arguing that this tendency of pushing what they called memory laws. That's why they coined this term, les lois mémorielles, is absolutely unconstitutional. It goes against academic freedom of expression, even if there are no punitive punitive clauses in this legislation. They are creating this kind of unhealthy competition. Helpful to their mobilization was also the fact that a very similar law, but when the majority in the French Assembly was by the right wing, a similar law, Mekashira law, was adopted that would recognize the obligation to teach the positive role of French colonialism somewhere in Algeria, for example, right? So it's not necessarily that the left wing was very active in promoting this kind of laws. For example, Holocaust denial law was adopted also under the promotion of the then communist, deputy Gaisson. The right wing also kind of discovered this potential of mobilization, and since then that has been nonstop, playground actually all over the Europe between right and the left in changing the role, who will use, regulation of history, either punitive or non-punitive, for postulating something that they consider to be the ontological truth about the certain European nation. But in this way, we've discovered that memory laws can be adopted in both ways: punitive, so with a penalizing clause, this classical Holocaust denial provisions throughout Europe. This paradigm is also dominant with regard to the European Union itself. Since 2008, there is the Council decision on xenophobic speech that obligates member states to adopt provisions on genocide denial and some criminal punishment. And interestingly enough, it's genocide denial, so it's beyond transcending the confines of Holocaust. And then there are non-punitive declaratory memory laws. And yet the historians back then, mobilizing in the organization which was called Liberté pour l'Histoire, being very active through the series of op-eds and in the French and other newspapers like Le Monde, they were arguing that also non-punitive declaratory memory laws are not that innocent. They're creating this neurotic climate, you need to justify and that you are correct, and also it's getting hardly, reconcilable with rationalities. How long can we go back? So if it's about colonialism, can the Phoenicians claim that they were tortured by the Greeks, and everybody was tortured by the Roman Empire throughout Europe? So where are the confines? Where are the boundaries of how long can you go with this fashion of punitive or non-punitive laws? It's interesting, Giacomo mentions Pierre Nora, who of course coins Lieu de Mémoire, the terminology that is super functional until these days in memory politics. Pierre Nora famously refers to this competition of adopting memory laws by both right wing and the left wing in the epoch as le sport pour ma français. So for him, it was kind of a purely French sport of postulating the historical virtues on and instrumentalizing them at both right and left spectrums. But what started happening also throughout 2000s is getting beyond punitive and non-punitive memory laws, is also the appearance and emergence of the laws regulating areas of naturalization and citizenship as increasingly based on historical ties or language, the phenomenon that in a way existed even before, but became even more promulgated, as I will be showing through my Spanish and Portuguese examples, somewhere in 2000s. But there is also a kind of a rupture where which is not very clear. I mean, probably rupture is actually the wrong word. There is a transition, elevation that is happening throughout 2000s, which clearly shows that memory laws are transcending into something which is rather broader spectrum of legal governance of historical memory and its elevation on the constitutional level. So where do we then find mnemonic constitutionalism in the constitutions, right? So if it's about, is it only about ritual and apology and distributive justice, so this is also something that is sensible, something material? Obvious examples are, of course, preambles, avowals, constitutional provisions, and amendments. although not always the case, but sometimes they're very theatrical, and Fidesz constitution in this respect is one of the central examples, very well described in the literature, with again, Hungary doing something very simple, similar to the 1944 France, saying that basically both Nazi and communist regimes in Hungary were illegal, and therefore Hungary is an innocent angel. And therefore, all of that constitutionally doesn't exist. There is kind of constitutional rupture, but constitutionalism of Hungary always existed. It has been embedded in the crown of Saint Stephen, you know, this medieval saint, and Hungary, all indeed throughout its history, is protected, you know, the European civilization against the Islamic barbarians, and later against communists and the Nazis. The whole constitutional project of Hungary is kind of affected by this very powerful mnemonic line, historicized lines. And in the countries like Hungary, with the declination of rule of law standards throughout the 2000s, we've observed more and more appeal in justifying ontological security also of the current political governance regimes and explanation of constitutional choices with the redress to history. So this constitutional project is not accidental. While some other countries in the region, like Poland, do not follow this step back, but essentially create a parallel institutionalized elements like institutes of national remembrance with the quasi-parliamentary functions, that in the absence of the changed constitution and rupture, like in Hungary during the peace period, recreate a very similar dynamics and populate constitutional discussions with references to history, clearly instrumentalize history. Then statutes and collective memory themselves, so memory loss of the constitutional character, that again very well describes countries like Poland and partially Russia, and this militancy that is aggravated for the manufacturing of conflicts. But then citizenship laws themselves, and citizenship as a constitutional foundation, is something that in most countries you learn about citizenship actually in constitutional classes. It's about, but usually it's about the acquisition you sign, where you saw in the naturalization procedures your duties and the rights. But what we've been observing in Europe in the past 20 years is the formation of citizenship regimes out of memory. And I would even argue as far as to say that the EU citizenship regime created by the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 is also populated with this dynamics, this idea of a myth that we actually had fundamental rights from the Treaty of Rome somehow, and in 1992 we only codified them in Maastricht, and we inserted provisions, which are these days 2021, on citizenship themselves, and provisions on the fundamental rights, but they existed because Europe was the project that was about democracy and not only about internal market. And this mythology is also very much populated by the idea that from Finland to Malta, there is something that unites all of these demos, and it's not only the internal market, and the consolidating point there that they have a common history. And the only point that of an agreement about common history is somehow the Holocaust, or even earlier, the ideas that the Jews are prosecuted, including, starting from Venetian ghettos, giving the rise of the word, and getting to the Shoah. And when you look into what commissions spend money in terms of the Citizenship for Europe programs in the past 15 years, the dynamics is clearly history of World War II. Also, the La Maison d'Histoire, this House of History in Brussels, as the project of the institutions, is also very much narrating the story of World War II, and kind of the idea that, yes, it is beyond the internal market. Yes, there is this political component there. Yes, there is this telos, but this is kind of the citizenship that belongs to the history of the Second World War in the first place. So I've already mentioned a couple of memory loss in France, including Loi Guesson, Loi Arminier. There was also not surviving, not a long period, the law that recognized the Armenian genocide. Loi Taubira recognized slavery as crime against humanity. Loi Répatriée, this revoked right that required schools to teach the positive aspects of French colonialism. Technically, until these days, only two are functionable, 2 are not in disuse, it's loi Guesson, this Holocaust denial clause, and the loi Taubira that recognize the slavery as the crime against humanity. And again, it is important to remember that France gave the rise to this mobilization through this Liberté pour l'Histoire, mobilization of historians that brought the whole subject of memory to the comparative constitutionalism. And yet, there is really an interesting phenomenon in terms of rupture in scholarly studies about memory loss. All of those discussions, if you look at them, it's basically 2000s, early 2000s. Somewhere between 2005 and 2008, the subject becomes very much declined. In literature, we are moving again into this Holocaust denialism, and maybe a little bit about Armenian genocide denialism up until 2015, I would say. The comparative constitutional lawyers, human rights lawyers, if they are looking into history in Europe, the most interesting decision is, of course, Perinček in Strasbourg. It's about, so what are we doing with Armenian genocide denial, and very lengthy Grand Chamber decision that explains that Armenian genocide is very difficult from the Holocaust. Therefore, we won't use this technique that Strasbourg used about marge d'appréciation, leaving it to the appreciation of the member states. And this appreciation of the member states is very often taken contextualizing things historically. So it's almost inviting, justification of by virtue of mnemonic constitutionalism. And yet the subject of loi mémorielle as such is very, not figuring that much in literature until Central and Eastern Europe comes into the playground in the 2000s. And before getting there, I will mention one interesting case of the Netherlands that decided 20 years after. So loi Guesson is 2000, right? And then we are getting into 2019, 2020 discussion to wake up and say, well, as the Kingdom of the Netherlands, we are also colonial empire. In fact, the Kingdom of the Netherlands still has overseas possessions. Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, are the sunnier parts of the reigning kingdom. So should we do something like the French? Because it sounds noble, we need to recognize the colonial atrocities. Interestingly enough, a motion comes for this in the Senate, and it's all about Western, it's all about Caribbean possessions and Latin American possessions. Let's apologize for that, and not, let's say, for the biggest colony of the Netherlands, which is Indonesia. But okay, apart from this interesting nuance, the question is whether the Netherlands really needed that, right? And accidentally, I was also invited by the Foreign Ministry to produce a report on whether Netherlands needs to adopt a memory law in similar to the French sample. And my advice was rather neutral. I mean, I'm not a politician, so I was just exploring pros and cons of adopting memory law in France and what they actually achieved with this. And I came to the conclusion, which I modestly should say was, I don't think it's because of my scholarly importance, but just because of the Dutch pragmatism, became the functional solution in the Netherlands. We've discovered very powerful mnemonic constitutionalism. In order to avoid the problem of, the French discussion, okay, we adopt, be it even non-punitive memory law, but then there will be attempts of mobilization and bringing the symmetry between Holocaust denialism and criminal code and saying that you cannot deny colonial atrocities or diminish them or trivialize them, because there is also banalisation the Holocaust, for example, right? So what do we do with that? Plus, inevitably, it drags it into another issue, which is extremely important, but also about the compensatory mechanism for the colonial atrocities and to whom they go, to the descendants of the victims. How do you establish them? Plus, unlike France, the Netherlands is not a republic, it is still the kingdom. And adopting a memory law by the Dutch parliament would have been actually extremely scandalous, because it means that Aruba and Curaçao and Bonaire are not consulted. And there was virtually no possible, consensus possible in adopting this memory law in non-punitive way with the constitutive lens of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. without them asking for one sort of compensation or another, because usually there is a very distinctive discussion between the Netherlands and its overseas possessions about distribution of budget and trade-offs, etc. So what happens first is that Prime Minister issues an apology, and then on the 100th abolition of slavery in the Caribbean, the Dutch king comes up with an apology, which is a published document. Yes, it's not parliamentary sustained, but it's still quasi-memory law in its soft way. And one can argue that this way of mnemonic constitutionalism is even more powerful than some sort of a memory law, because that can be changed. And as we've seen in the French example with memory law rotating between the guillotines of the right and the left-wing parliamentarians, this is something which is stable. Moreover, the monarch apologized not only for the colonial atrocities of the Dutch Empire itself, but also for the participation of the Dutch family in them. There is the whole committee, and millions of euro are spent there on establishing the crimes committed by supposedly by the Dutch monarchs themselves, and sustaining the regime of coloniality in Suriname and in the Caribbean. So in this way, one can argue that there is also the succession attributed to this, because the king is the direct successor, descendant of the monarchs that have promulgated colonialism in the Kingdom of the Netherlands previously. Well, then the country that is absolutely impossible not to mention when we are talking about mnemonic constitutionalism and citizenship regimes as very much pregnant with historical discussions is obviously Germany. With famous, or rather infamous, Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripping Jews of German citizenship, there was an inevitable question what Grundgesetz, what's the basic law, will do with the past atrocities, and the answer was the restoration of citizenship to the Jewish community, Article 116 of the basic law. So the idea that they never lost the citizenship, and their descendants have the right for the citizenship, the Jews who were deprived through the Nuremberg laws of the nationality of Germany. And a curious fact is that actually there was not a huge demand for German citizenship by the descendants of the Jews who managed to escape Germany or survive the Holocaust in Germany and other countries of Europe or Argentina or Israel, Canada, up until the 80s, 90s. As has been shown by the sociologists who are working in this area, I'm a huge fan in particular of Yossi Harpat's work and the research in Tel Aviv University on the reasons why people with the Jewish descent start very actively applying for second citizenship, usually European citizenship, is as a security card. And that's the discussion that drives us into the 90s and to 2000s. Before, it was almost shameful to get the citizenship of the country that provided the mass atrocities to the Jewish population. And recently, we are moving into a more controversial but extremely fascinating discussion on the constitutional commitment to Israel and the Jewish life itself as the part of the national interest, Staatsräson, in Germany itself. The paradigm that is embedded in the local citizenship acts of the London and of the local federal lands, but also, which we see in the recent 2023 newest citizenship law in Germany, very much pronounced as the commitment to Israel's right to exist for naturalization procedures as a reply to the growth of anti-Semitism after the events of October 2023. And this paradigm is usually addressed in literature as Nie wieder, Never Again, My Pew. And interestingly, it is instrumentalized not only for the aspects of Jewish history. If we're actually going into Nunca Más, somewhere in Latin America, it has nothing to do with the Jews. So the same paradigm of this Nie wieder, Nunca Más, My Pew has been adopted in Latin America in the context of transition from authoritarian regimes to democracy, in particular in Chile and in Argentina. But again, we see this line of mnemonic constitutionalism as very deeply connected to citizenship. Restoration of citizenship, understanding of citizenship, certain sometimes controversial commitments in terms of geopolitics and formulation of kind of ontological stability of the nation that are going, strictly speaking, beyond the apology. You know, they're driving us into this terrain of restorative justice and explanation of security choices. In this respect, Spain and Portugal are both extremely interesting because when we are talking about the persecution of Jews, of course, we are 90% cases talking about the Holocaust. And Spain adopted back in 2015 the law that grants Spanish citizenship to the Sephardic Jews that has been removed from Spain through the Inquisition. Lots of them were killed by the Los Reyes Católicos, Isabel de Castilla and Ferdinand de Aragon in the 15th, partially throughout 16th centuries, and the idea that their descendants also have the right of return. There should be some restorative justice for them. Well, Spain adopted a very similar legislation for reparative citizenship in the same year, 2015. And I've been looking into the dynamics of the applications and how the claims for application have been made, because back then in the Iberian Peninsula, it's very difficult to establish whether somebody is a descendant of a Sephardic Jew from what constitutes these days Spain or what constitutes these days Portugal. Sometimes it's mixed families, sometimes it's mixed surnames. So technically, those people who can prove through some galactical interpretation their lineage from the Sephardic Jews from those terrains, they can claim both. And most of the cases for the application of citizenship address was also the advice of the legal firm specializing in citizenship, which is these days a huge business, was to go for Portuguese citizenship, because in Spain it was a way more complicated. 3 years of residence, the knowledge of the Spanish language, at least it's some basic language, whereas in Portugal it was almost like if you can prove it, you know, you don't need to live in Portugal, you don't need to pass the knowledge of the Portuguese language, you are just getting it. But again, we are getting into the technique of seeing citizenship, and not only citizenship like this republican idea of our duties and belonging, but citizenship in pure institutional sense. How do we get it through naturalization or restoration as the historical subject? And Spain recently used the same technique for the restoration of citizenship to the descendants of the victims of the Franco regime, including children and grandchildren of the Spaniards, in addition to separate lay the memoria historica that exists in Spain, and that relates to the history of Franco's regime, which is non-punitive and also quite controversial in the sense that for the left wing it's extremely weak, for the right wing it's anyhow scandalous because it postulates historical truth in certain inadvertent way. And Israel, of course, is the country that is impossible not to look into, because this is the example of mnemonic constitution without formal constitution. So famously, it's one of a very few countries in the world, along with, I don't know, Canada and Britain, that do not have codified basic law. So in the absence of the codified basic law, it functions as distributed in between several fundamental legislative acts. One of them is, of course, Law of Return of 1950, it's Nationality Law of 1952, which are absolutely foundational for the Jewish identity in the sense that they permit automatic granting of citizenship for Jewish immigrants, again, as a tool of this ontological discourse, as the kind of return to the historical motherland. Even more controversial in this respect is the Nation State Law 2018 that reinforces Jewish identity of the state even further, and bringing a certain citizenship paradigm that goes even beyond what was made possible by the law of return and nationality of the law. So the idea that if you have some Jewish descendancy, and not strictly speaking galactical, it's not like Jew by your mother, but if you have one of yours has been extended in the 70s up to your grandfather, you can do the Aliyah, and then after a certain naturalization period in Aliyah is kind of this residence in the confines of the state of Israel. and then gradually you can be granted full citizenship rights. And again, it's a certain reflection of this never again in Israel constitutional framework for the protection of the Jewish life. Then the memory laws in Central and Eastern Europe are coming into this playground in the 2010s, and I would say that they completely reconfigure this whole discussion. So it's almost like this initial discussion on Les Mois Mémoriels in France is le passé. You know, it's not very much present in literature. So, of course, countries like Poland, Russia, Ukraine, especially in the context of Russo-Ukrainian war, completely monopolized this. And also, they are pure champions in terms of adopting memory laws, both punitive and non-punitive. And I think in the both in academic literature and in more type of media discourses, the subject has become scandalized, with Poland adopting in 2018 the law that was the amendment to the Institute of National Remembrance, which in itself, as I mentioned earlier, in Poland is a quasi-parliamentary institution that adopts regulation on naming and renaming streets, monuments, who assesses both Nazi occupation and Soviet regime and their victims, and kind of builds this pantheon of heroes and martyrs. And with this amendment to the statute of the Institute, there is the criminal prohibition of attributing the crimes committed by the Third Reich to the Polish nations or the Poles. Controversial. Yeah. Why is it controversial? Is that, I mean, on the one hand, there is no doubt that the Holocaust has been provided by the Nazi Germans, and places like Auschwitz were not invented by Poles in the peaceful town of Oświęcim in Polish, and yet it has been a matter of extreme irritation from both right, left, and center in Poland when somebody would accidentally drop a phrase like Obama on one of the visits. And how about this Polish concentration camps? It's almost as if it were Polish, right? So the idea that any attribution of the crimes committed by the Nazis to Poles should be prohibited with 3 to 5 years of imprisonment, and also the crimes of the Ukrainian nationalists in the interwar period should be acknowledged, and their denial should be also prohibited. But then again, while predominant absolute, I mean, in pure numbers, millions of people were definitely killed by the Germans and not Poles. As any nation, the Poles are also not innocent, and there were actually quite multiple cases, including of atrocities in the interwar and during the World War II in Poland, with including the Poles burning alive their Jewish neighbors by hundreds and thousands. And though those are isolated cases, and in Yad Vashem and Jerusalem, Poles are represented as the nation that has the most kind of awards for the saving of the Jews, let's also not forget that Poland was the country that was most populated by the Ashkenazi Jews, and where by pure numbers the Holocaust would have happened in the terrain. Also, this Ukrainian element has been always extremely controversial, because what constitutes Western Ukraine for Poles constitutes Galicia and Eastern Poland. And Ukraine itself started mimicking this institutional paradigm of regulating historical memory from Poland, with the imposition of a less powerful, although increasingly more vocal during the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance. So we see also the infrastructure of mnemonic constitutionalism being on the rise, and getting in the controversial dialogue, contestation, opposition, when we're talking about mnemonic constitutionalism as governance, right, in this international relations with Poland, and at the same time with Russia, because presumably this rise and mushrooming of memory laws in Central and Eastern Europe has been also the fact that enfant terrible, with Putin, has become extremely active with 2014 occupation of Donbass, annexation of Crimea, again, all explained by the historical belonging of those territories to the Russian Empire. So constantly problematizing their huge Russian minorities question in some way in Latvia and in Estonia, and of course those exchanges on vision of history in World War II and between Poland and Russia, because for Russia, of course, there is no Second World War, in the sense that what is celebrated on the tomorrow, on the 9th of May, not to celebrate it today on the 8th of May with a huge parade, is Великая Отечественная война, Great Patriotic War. And its confines are not 1939, because that would bring inconvenient topic of the occupation partition of Poland, but it's all about the Germany entering the confines of Soviet Union. So, now we probably need to use this. No? Thank you so much. Well, I'll skip Hungary for the sake of time. Only again draw your attention by this extreme symbolism of the crown of Saint Stephen. So this is where mnemonic constitutionalism is almost converging with the ritualism. And this idea of that something can belong and can be a symbol of this, what Kim Scheppele once called aspirational constitutionalism, right? That's something which is not codified, but we see it as the constitutionalism in the making. There is also the concept of historical constitution, which is a separate subject into which degrade forms this mnemonic constitutionalism in Hungary. Russia is, of course, is impossible absolutely to avoid there. This is the matter of the book that we recently co-edited with my colleagues, Alexandra Klishchinska-Grabie, Maria Malksvan, and Angelika Nussberger, about memory loss in the context of the Russo-Ukrainian War. So on the one hand, Russia comes up with the laws that prohibit the diminishing of the heroism of defending the fatherland during World War II, punishment of the desacralizing military symbols of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, and criminalizing the rehabilitation of Nazism and the disrespect for military glory narratives, essentially prohibiting any alternative discourses on the history of Second World War, where Soviet Union was not a victim and the hero, but in itself complicit in stirring up the violence and the initiation of the war through Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. And Ukraine obviously responds to this with the decommunization laws of 2015. So this urge to use memory as a shield. So if Russia uses as a sword, so let's recognize also the pantheons of heroes of the Ukrainian nationalists. Let's also prohibit the Soviet symbols, because until 2015 in Ukraine, that was an ambiguous subject. And there is a huge difference between, in 2015, Ukrainian memory laws were criticized by pretty much every historian in the West, including Timothy Snyder, who is these days a huge friend of Ukraine, apparently, something that goes beyond necessary, that is absolutely undemocratic and scandalous. And only very few scholars back then were arguing that it is a matter of ontological security for Ukraine, whereas Russia is manufacturing the hatred towards Jews through state media, and this is the ongoing project. And also there is a huge difference in the sense that only one memory law in this package of folk decommunization memory laws in Hungary back then was of punitive criminal nature. It's about use of symbols. So equalizing use of communist and Nazi symbols. All the rest were non-punitive, whereas practically all the memory laws adopted in Russia since 2014 were adopted through criminal code. So there's a clear difference. Belarus is a peculiar case in the sense that on the one hand, it mimics the Russian posture on with Lukashenko's regime on 1941, 1945 in terms of Great Patriotic War. And in order to legitimize Belarusian opposition for the Lukashenko's regime, it is extremely important to show the legacy of Belarusian nationalists with the Nazis, and that explains why after the unsuccessful coup d'etat in 2020, followed up by the Russian invasion, fully fledged invasion in Ukraine in February 2022, which happened through the territory of Belarus, and in this way Lukashenko's regime is absolutely complicit. In advance of this and after this, the long genocide of the Belarusian people was promulgated, which was in a way marrying the conceptual framework of both Polish memory law of 2018, the idea that do not attribute the crimes that were committed by the Nazis to the Polish nation, and Russian view on the Great Patriotic War. So the idea that Belarus in pure numbers was the country most the victim of the Nazis, and therefore every third person in Belarus on the present-day territory of Belarus died during Great Patriotic War. So let's call it a genocide. Moreover, let's call it a genocide of the Belarusian people without mentioning the word Jew a single time. And of course, there were the whole Belarusian Catholic or villages, or Orthodox villages that were completely burned by the Germans, like Katyn. And yet they still constitute a very small fraction in comparison to the number of the Jewish victims. And again, along with Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Lithuania were the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish population in Central Eastern Europe, with the Yiddish being revived actually in the territory of Belarus as a literature form. Then again, to end up this presentation, we are moving towards my most recent research, about which I have to gloss over for the sake of time. We've been talking so far mostly about Europe, right? I mean, Israel is an interesting case, but obviously this is the liberal democracy that mimics in many respects the familiar samples of constitutionalism in Europe or in the United States of America. An interesting question is, what are you doing in other parts of the world, right? And China, of course, is a huge elephant in the room in terms of manufacturing history in a way which is mimicking the Russian and European way, and it's still very different. I mean, if you're going to the Chinese parade, military parade, you're actually up to a huge surprise. I mean, for Russians, it's undoubtedly that Russia won World War II. For the Chinese, apparently it's China who is the winner of World War II, and that possibly also explains the party-led memory governance and memory loss on martyrs and heroes. Some of them also, although a tiny fraction, with the punitive effect for the denialism, and stands on anti-historical nihilism, something that they borrowed from the Leninism in Russia. So this idea that a true patriot, a true Chinese patriot person should be dedicated to the historical achievements of the nation and cannot be a nihilist, and in terms of not denialist but nihilist, cannot be ambivalent about this patriotic ritual that is very much streamlined in digital remembrance, because this pantheon of heroes and martyrs is actually fascinating. China is recreating the online databases and making artificial intelligence mimicking of the figures of the died persons and reconstructing their family stories. So there is this huge digital remembrance that is going on there. South Korea, which, let's not forget, until the 90s, end of 80s rather, has been also a dictatorship, right-wing dictatorship, with its all atrocities, including the infamous Gwangju massacre, mimics it to the degree that there is the Gwangju Denial Prohibition Act in 2023 that also has several years of imprisonment. So mimicking the memory of the Holocaust, as the Holocaust not present in the Korean memory space, but for the local atrocities. And then this is the country with almost 20 Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is the most developed, actually, I would say, throughout the world, terrain of nurturing mnemonic constitutionalism through transitional justice. And that gets to everything from North Korea and the division of the peninsula to comfort women and Gwangju massacre, Jeju Island massacre, etc., etc. Essentially, it's about mimicking the European ways, especially this punitive and non-punitive, but putting them in this context of reconciliation. So this idea that European-style memory governments can be adopted locally through stronger ritualism, through patriotic education, through historically mediated identity, and through something which is not that vocal as in Europe, although in South Korea, China, and Taiwan, when positioned vis-a-vis Japan and comfort women, it becomes very vocal also as a shield and swords in terms of international relations. And then Japan itself, it's an amazing point for researching mnemonic constitutionalism, and not only in a sense like in the the starting point, this Würde, this dignity in the German dignitas in the German constitution, as the of the basic law in post-war German constitution, the idea that we do not populate it too much with the history of World War II through some sort of a preamble, but we put this dignity as this central, force unifying the German constitutionalism. And that also has historical repercussions, explanations. In Japan, it's of course non-militarism as the starting point in the constitution, but also this whole idea of that you're living in different constitutional eras in Japan, and they are linked to the emperor. Shava, Heise, we're now living in the Reiwa epoch according to Japanese constitutionalism. In this respect, it links us both to the crown of Saint Stephen, but also one day it might link us to this Dutch way of ritualism and apology, especially with the controversial, visits of the Japanese emperors to the shrines that are connected to the World War II. So at a certain point, we could see a different reconciliation dynamics in using emperors for this sort of mnemonic constitution without adopting memory laws as such. So 4 key signs of growing mnemonic constitutionalism are constitutionalizing historical narratives explicitly or implicitly, a rise of quasi-parliamentary institutions of governance of memory, citizenship shaped through historical discourse, instrumentalization of history to justify internal and external state of action, which we see especially intensified during Russo-Ukrainian war. And in the European context, the specific role of the Jewish past still remains very visible, both in European integration and locally and at the EU level. Never again and collective traumas as being the foundation of European mnemonic constitutionalism, and citizenship laws as a bridge between historical memory and constitutional identity. And last but not least, so I feel that it needs to be finished on something theatrical. So this presentation was all about whether we are still governing in our constitutions through laws, through norms, or we are governing through the anniversaries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Sorry for my size during these last minutes. I think that it was amazing, not only shaping the concept of what are memory laws and what is mnemonic constitutionalism, because, like sometimes it's difficult to try to understand the differences among them. And I think that one important aspect that we can get from this presentation is precisely the fact that usually when we speak about mnemonic constitutionalism, when we speak about the use of memory, is usually thought about how it is abused, the concept, what is the negative aspect of memory when it's used in constitution to shape the legal governance of it. Instead, I think that giving the example, for example, of Poland, I think that that gave the other perspective. So not the abuse, not what we can find, for example, in the fundamental law of Hungary, as you also mentioned, but how instead through recalling memory in Poland, they deny the responsibility of what they have not done. So not only the use of memory and how it is used to recognize their the identity of the people of that country, as in Hungary, but the use of memory not to recognize that identity of the people of that country, such as in Poland. So I think that it was amazing to have both the perspective, all of these examples from these different countries, also the perspective from Asia, especially because of the fact that you also said it's something new, something that you are writing on it right now. So thank you so much for today's presentation. I don't know if any of you has a question for Uladzislau. There is a question, Enrico. To get closer, otherwise I can... Stiamo prendendo il gelato. Non c'è il gelato. Magari. Per il momento sì, Enrico, if you please can come here. Enrico is a postdoc here at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Constitutional Law.
Thank you. It was a really interesting speech, and I have a question about the Italian Constitution, most of all about the third final provision that I think it contains a sort of mark about a tragical event, the homicide of Matteotti. Because of this provision is about the composition of the first parliament of Italy, of the first parliament of the Italian Republic after the writing of the Constitution. And it is a provision about senators by right of the first Senate. And this provision said and says that the former deputies of the parliament that during the fascism were banished from the parliament for the protests against Matteotti murder, they could be senators by right of the first Senate of Italy. So in the 1926, there was the act that expelled these deputies from the Italian parliament because they protests, they organized the protests for Matteotti murder, while in 1948 they were senators by right for this provision. So my question is if that provision could be considered an example of mnemonic constitutionalism.
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, I know very little about the case, but technically, this is the open definition of this mnemonic constitution in the sense that whenever there is the space in the constitutional text itself or preamble that can leave it to the interpretation that is bound in terms of explaining the current political choices with the past, I think this is par excellence constitutes mnemonic constitutionalism. It's just that I would love to comment on this, but I'd be absolutely honest, I know so little about this that about the specific Italian situation, I don't have any further comments. But again, if we're returning to the mnemonic constitutionalism method, and not only as a concept, I think if somebody's trying to functionalize this case, like you're writing an essay or an academic article, I think mnemonic constitutionalism is a methodology that combines memory studies, comparative constitutionalism itself, discourse analysis can be extremely helpful because it gives you tools to interpret that case very differently, and indeed look into this from the paradigm of the historical justice. So yeah, I hope I answer your question.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thank you, Enrico. Federico? Federico is a first-year PhD student here at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, Constitutional Law, Comparative Perspectives.
Thank you very much for your speech. I have actually a couple of questions. The first one is whether we can somehow, in some context, actually justify this. It could be provocative as a question, justify these laws in the sense that any polity needs a tool for legitimization, and we can either find it in some historical narrative. So we have memory laws in general, especially the most not aggressive, let's say the most punitive ones, not the punitives, but also the others. Somehow, if we can have some kind of justification for this, and I'll go with this question because the other is over there.
Because it's in the heart of the research, yeah. So memory laws reconcilable with democracy, rule of law, fundamental rights discourse, and the whole scholarship by both comparative lawyers and partial also political scientists in the subject is there. And the starting point is very often, I think, is a little bit naive. It's what historical mobilization produced in the 90s. And very often when I meet historians, for example, that's what I hear as well. It's like any intervention of lawyers and judges in this domain of history is absolutely wrong. Everything should be forbidden. And everything is a propaganda. Even doesn't matter whether it's right, left, or center. Historians should be left free. What I'm a little bit afraid is that the way we've constructed our educational systems, urban spaces, and even culture is to such degree pregnant with history and historical governance that it's virtually impossible not to have any regulation of history at all. The way we teach history at schools is usually done through one sort of a, decree, let's say, from the Ministry of Education, and those handbooks of history are usually approved somewhere. And it's usually a point of an extremely sensitive nature, because we all grew up in countries where we since childhood know that our countries are the biggest victims, and everybody committed terrible atrocities, but we were also very heroic. Unless you're in Germany and you grew up in a different paradigm, this in literature, they called non-exculpatory, inculpatory and exculpatory memory loss. So in most cases, we live in the culture of exculpatory guilt, exculpatory memory loss, soft or not, or punitive, where we are said that, we were innocent victims and our grandfathers and grandmothers, but, everybody else committed terrible atrocities. So this is usually the delegation of the guilt. And there can technically be a less, intrusive part, which is none, which is self-inculpatory, so culpa mia. Yeah, you are taking this inculpation, you are taking this guilt on yourself, and that is technically what Germany, partially Austria, has produced, which is somehow also an invisible figure in Italy with the fascist regimes, although of course to the lesser and very specific degree. But even then, the question emerges where the self-exculpatory memory loss are less, they are more justifiable. And in years of research in this area, I came to the conclusion that we can come up with the certain techniques of distinguishing between memory loss in their justifying. We should always start with the assumption of punitive and non-punitive memory loss, and come to and my conclusion is that punitive memory loss should be only justified in a democratic society, and they're reconcilable with freedom of expression, freedom of association, only if there is a vital danger, and by danger we really mean some sort of security, not some vague l'ordre public, public order justification for the nation. And in this respect, we can talk about, like, as of returning to the debate about Ukrainian decommunization laws in 2015. Back then, I was arguing that actually Ukrainian decommunization laws are completely justifiable. In the way of we are talking about the nation which was back then. I mean, the war didn't start in 2022, had a significant part of its territory annexed or occupied. But comparing the developments in Poland with the Polish, Act of 2018, it is extremely questionable. Who was that person endangering Poland with the accusation and attributing the guilt to Poles for the Third Reich, apart from the historians somewhere in Canada and USA who were researching, those places of Jedwabne in Poland where the atrocities were committed by Poles, right? So the assumption, again, if it's about justification, yes, punitive are more suspicious, and punitive to me is something that, in terms of proportionality and striking the basis, can be justified only if there is like quasi, existential security issue at place. Then we can divide this memory loss into self-inculpatory and self-exculpatory. And for me, self-inculpatory are less suspicious. Although, again, we can talk about cancel culture, we can see about instrumentalization of self-exculpatory memory loss, and yet they are less kind of suspicious and more justifiable in terms of striking proportionality. And while it is impossible to avoid memory regulation, memory governance as such, both punitive and non-punitive ways. I would say that those techniques and trying to strike the proportionality will probably for the next years will be the governing paradigm and within the Council of Europe, within the European Union, in terms of assessing memory loss. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Well, this is not actually my field of research, but it's very interesting and rich. And as an Asian Chinese, actually, you know, like since you just wrote an essay on Eastern Asian, and given the move that Japan is now taking, and the possibility of revising their constitution, and which creates tensions between China-Japan relations, and like given this like geopolitical tension now, like how it relates to your research, like how it impacts your like how it impacts the research that you are presenting, and like how it, I just wanted to know like how it relates to so this is now a situation, like how it relates to the research we are talking about, like and what's the impact, and or how they prove of your research, just out of curiosity. Thank you.
Chanqing is a second-year PhD student here at Sant'Anna.
Fantastic. And which region of China do you come from? Which region of China do you come from, out of curiosity? Bandung City. Okay, super interesting. Yeah. Well, indeed, this is an excellent question, because that lets us on the terrain of memory governance as a concept. You remember, memory, mnemonic constitutionalism as a concept, mnemonic constitutionalism as a method, and mnemonic constitutionalism as the governance. And China, Japan, in this respect, extremely interesting case, where the revision, or that the plan to revise the constitution of Japan constitutes immediately this geopolitical problem with China, because essentially we're talking about the removal of this peaceful clause that Japan basically is deprived of the army and cannot have it. Yeah. In this way, mnemonic constitutionalism, or the attempts to reform the constitutional models and populate it with it, or substitute the historical figure there and the justification there, is about seeking a closer alliance with Taiwan and the United States in a certain way as well, although already more controversially, and postulating Japan, you know, as the entity that needs the security embodiment in this constitution for the possible attack of China, mainland China, in case there is the war erupting between China and Japan. In China itself is viewed as absolutely scandalous and controversial, and the rise of the Japanese militancy and its protection of quasi-independence of Taiwan. So while I'm not a political scientist and I don't do international relations, a colleague of mine, Maria Malkso, studies these issues in terms of deterrence, political deterrence, and I believe they have the instruments to measure how the factor of changes in the legislation and populating it with certain historical memory subjects is used as the mechanism of deterrence in terms of constructing this ontological security of the member states, and pre-constructing international relations regionally, let's say in the context of Russia, Ukraine, and populating formulating security as the history concern, and in the context of China and Japan. So I think for somebody who does that research from the constitutional perspective, again, then the third paradigm of mnemonic constitutionalism as governance becomes important, and perhaps also second, a theoretization of mnemonic constitutionalism as a certain methodology to explain what's going on in international relations or sub-regional relations between Japan and China can be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Do we have other questions? Ludovico is also a second-year PhD student here at.
So thank you very much for your terrific presentation. I mean, you made us travel between different systems and different memory laws. So I was researching on the Asia Pacific perspective. So yeah, exactly. So something completely different. But so I came across the new Tuvaluans constitution approved in 2023. And I would like to ask you, while listening to your presentation, I was impressed because so we talk about historical events, historical traumas that also were pivotal in rewriting or writing memory laws, right? And it made me think about how now different events such as climate change, sea level rise, so extreme events can really impact, on countries such as Tuvalu that is going to disappear the next few years, and how the Tuvaluan government tried to shape its new constitution in a very mnemonic way. So we are trying to preserve the legacy of Tuvalu through our constitution, because Tuvalu, well, in the next few years can completely disappear. But what we are doing is to really draft and to adopt a constitution that will preserve the memory of Tuvalu. So my question is new events, new impacts, and also climate change are changing the paradigm also of memory loss, maybe. So because we are creating new memory laws or a new mnemonic constitutionalism, also bearing in mind what is going on in the Pacific, and so this was my question. Is more a suggestion, maybe.
This is extremely fascinating because while memory is linked to, it's not unusual to look into memory. There is this whole subfield on memory politics that looks into, let's say, terroristic acts or emergency disasters and the memory of how they are preserved or remembered, and how they are also instrumentalized for national domestic politics or international relations. Let's say in the context of Central and Eastern Europe, there is the cluster research that has been concentrated on the Chernobyl and its effect on not purely on the remembrance of Chernobyl, but on the politics, on commemoration of the Chernobyl disaster in different countries and the way it is perceived. I'm afraid I have very little to say about Tuvalu in general, but I can imagine that even in the absence of the nation state, if the nation is preserved, it can preserve bits of its mnemonic constitutionalism through ritualization of memory. And as futuristic as it sounds, it may be, some stream of the future research on mnemonic constitutionalism. What are we doing for the nations in exile or nations that have become, the subject of the ecological disasters and with the disappearing statehood because the territory is disappearing. But yeah, that's probably the matter for the very, very futuristic and future normative discussion. But thank you for bringing my attention to this case.
Thank you. Also, because I was also studying a topic similar to that one. And precisely, I mean, like, there could be also a sub-question of it, in the sense that memory in constitution is used to then preserve, an identity, but then what's the final aim when the state doesn't exist anymore? So you have a constitution, it would be the remembrance of the state through the constitution, thanks to the memory that was included in that.
Constitution as lieu de mémoire. There is also this, I mean, this is not something revolutionary. I've met it in literature before. You can look at the constitution itself as the place of memory, especially for the disappearing nations or contested statehood, for all sorts of diasporas. And And again, if we're getting from the terrain less norms and rights and duties and more anniversaries and kind of this discursive analysis, this can be an original way to research the constitutional narratives.
Thank you. We have, okay, other two final questions and then we go. Yeah, and then we wrap up and we meet for the coffee break.
Very short. A short question, really. So thanks for the presentation. It was really rich, very, very rich. So you made this connection between memory and the citizenship acts by calling them quasi-memory laws. And you also observed that in the West, there is this trend in extending citizenship because of historical reasons. So I'm only curious to know if there is the same trend also in Eastern Europe, or what is the trend there? So thank you.
Yeah, there is an interesting case in Poland. In that case, it's a so we have it there. Then it's a camouflage kind of way of citizenship through the so-called Karta Polaka, the card of a Polish person, which is given as a sort of a simplified residence to the people mostly coming from Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine as the terrains with the biggest Polish diasporas, partially from Kazakhstan as well, and Russia itself. And although this is not an immediate granting of citizenship, it's a simplified citizenship. It's almost like, when we are talking about pecuniary citizenship like whether you can buy some, citizenship in Malta or in Cyprus, the matter of this famous case of Commission versus Malta recently. So how about simplified citizenship by virtue of simplified residence? So usually in Central Europe, those cases are about accelerated citizenship, but through historical heritage. And a somewhat similar model functions also in Hungary, with the idea that there should be restorative immediate attribution of citizenship to post-Trianon territories that Hungary lost, somewhere in, of course, Romania, in Slovakia, in Vojvodina, I think, in Serbia, right? So again, the track that is accelerated and which is not very much accountable to statistics, which was one of the theories also for Fidesz Party of gaining voices through the diaspora votes. But yes, the kind of recent dynamics of citizenship in Central and Eastern Europe is also indicating the same. I would even say that in addition to jus soli, jus sangue, jus pecunia, with this buying of citizenship, we can even start talking about something like historical, receiving of the mode of citizenship. But other constitutions would perhaps argue that this is the part of naturalization, just a different way of naturalization. Thanks.
Thank you. We have our last question of this panel.
Yeah, I'm very curious about a lot of things, but in your last slide before this one, I think you mentioned quasi-parliamentary institutions that have a role in governing memory. Are you referring to the Institute for National Remembrance? Can you tell us a bit more about this? Since, in fact, I first jumped into this institute last year at the eve of the presidential election, because I discovered that the peace candidate had no political background, and ultimately the current president of Poland had no political background in the narrow sense, but apparently his role had a quite important political, even constitutional dimension.
Or maybe I'll use this one. Yeah. Yes, this is excellent in the sense that Poland is a remarkable example of institutionalization of historical memory. Well, in Central and Eastern Europe, the model of distribution budgets for education has been traditionally done in the Soviet epoch through academies of sciences. So I think Yugoslavia had this, the Poland, of course, all post-Soviet republics. So Academy of Sciences were something where the money for education will go, and they will be spread almost like these days through national research grants, like we have in the countries of the European Union. So it's still a very powerful organization. Usually when you are a professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences, like my dear colleague Aleksandra Gliszczynska, with whom we've done this book, you're kind of a research professor. You don't have very few, if any, teaching obligations. So, just to give you an example, that the budget of this Institute of National Remembrance is 3 times higher than the budget of the whole Academy of Sciences of Poland. So clearly, with more democratic, less democratic, more progressive, which is a subjective factor, you know, peace or non-peace, Poland through the last 20 years has been distributing public money, which were meant for historical education, to the Institute of National Remembrance that was supposed to be this transitional justice mechanism, and it will be fine. But I mean, we are 30 years post-transition, so for how long can you be in the process of transitional justice with the positions symbolic and less symbolic created within that institute, and with some functions of that institute itself having quasi-parliamentary dimension in terms of like naming, renaming streets, suggesting the list of who were collaborating with the Nazis and the communists, and how, you know, the proceduralizing the whole transitional justice. It's in itself very controversial whether this is something that can be done only by the parliament or by this institute that is not subjugated by the parliament, parliamentary control, and even constitutional control. We don't have any precedent of this constitutional control over the institute. But the act of the institute, the statutory act itself, is parliamentary act. And this infamous Polish memory law, which in literature I think incorrectly is sometimes referred as Holocaust law. No, Poland has separate Holocaust denialism clause that doesn't have anything to do with this law, was the act amending the statute of the Institute of National Remembrance, giving it also the investigatory power to search for those people also abroad somewhere, I don't know, in Argentina, suggesting that Poles committed the crimes against the Jews, or this Ukrainian nationalists were not that bad somewhere in Galicia. So in this respect, this is it's an example of the rise of this quasi-parliamentary institutions of the governance of memory, which in itself is a clear signs of rapid progression of mnemonic constitutionalism.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking contribution this afternoon. Thank you so much for all your questions. I think that we can now stop the first panel and then have a 10-minute coffee break, and then come here back for the second session of today's seminar. Thank you so much.